Hello, everyone. Welcome to the War Report. Now, do we have quite the episode? It is, I dare say, spicy. It's going to be very. Apparently, Saudi Arabia, everyone's still turned against them, which is a bit of a surprise. I thought that was kind of blow over, but again, we do have some stuff on what's his name, Khashoggi, a bit of about his past that shows, makes you ask a few questions there. But let's jump right into it. So, out of all the things that made the world turn against Saudi Arabia, it was not their ties to 9/11. It was not the funding of radical Islamic terrorism across the world. It isn't the slaughter happening in Yemen right now. It's the death of some journalist who got the world to condemn Saudi Arabia. That being said, this has shed light on the war in Yemen and other issues. I'm willing to use this guy's death as a bludgeon. I'm willing to politicize this. I'm going to come out and say that. Now, as we discussed last week, condemnation has come from everyone from Bill Kristol, ironically enough, to Rand Paul. Now, Rand is one of the few people who previously criticized Saudi Arabia before any of this happened. Now, he actually did go as far as to say, as on Twitter, and I quote, Saudi Arabia is not our friend. They fund radicalism around the world. We don't need to be arming them. They're the worst actor out there promoting radicalism around the world. Much more bold than his previous statements, and it's funny because actually in the replies to that tweet you had some Saudi shill. I think his profile picture was actually of Mohammed bin Salman saying, "Oh no, it's the Iranians. They fund all the terrorism." And there was just a giant Twitter fight below that, which not really relevant, but I figured it's just funny to mention, like watching their bots out in full force. But basically every country besides Russia has a bot army. I've noticed Turkey and Saudi Arabia mainly on Twitter, but the sloppiness of this Saudi operation, assuming they actually did kill Khashoggi or whatever his name is, I can't even say his name right. I mean, but it just dispels a notion concerning the fact that they actually did kill him. You look at what they did is they didn't use cover names for their assassins. They did it in their own consulate. And this also goes to dispel the notion that Saudi Arabia is a key partner in fighting terrorism around the world. Everyone talks about how great their intelligence is, and I think this kind of draws some attention to it. But on top of this, the rage around Saudi Arabia, several companies and individuals have pulled out of the Future Investment Initiative, also known as Davos in the Desert. Now, a few of these individuals and companies include the CEO of Uber, CEO of JP Morgan, Viacom, Google Cloud, the president of the World Bank, General David Petraeus. I never thought I'd talk about him again. The president of the New York Stock Exchange, as well as many more. Now, while I am pleased that Saudi Arabia is losing all these investment opportunities and being condemned worldwide, the hypocrisy of many of those condemning Saudi Arabia still does not escape me. I mean, you have Petraeus, of all people. Need we even get into his record about what he's done, which I don't even need to highlight the hypocrisy here. I think it's self-evident.
Yeah. If anyone did just a little bit of scant research into who was Khashoggi, there would be hypocrisy on both the left and the right. He has his career began actually in 1988 when he befriended the sweetest, nicest 007 cave dwelling supervillain known as Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And there are photos in Lawrence's Wright book on the matter. Yeah, the freedom fighters. And so he's always been pro Saudi Arabia, by the way. I recall an RT program last year where he got into a yelling match on Crosstalk. Not unusual, but where he was said, you're not even a Saudi Arab citizen anymore. You can't even go back. And his reasoning, the problem is I have a problem with the prince, Mohammed bin Salman, but that doesn't describe the whole country. So Khashoggi was also published by the Washington Post. So he's friends with Osama bin Laden. So of course he would have been, he's basically a CIA asset, and that's what he was. He got many of the early interviews with Osama bin Laden, of course, the supervillain that nobody knew all that well. And the entire, Saudi family and the bin Laden family, of course, has huge ties with the Bush family. which to me is kind of interesting with all this emphasis on Khashoggi. He's literally like, once you scratch beneath him, all this other info comes out. For instance, um, Salman bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's older brother, um, basically saved the Bush family oil company, and later contributed heavily, or at least the family did, into the Carlyle Group, which profited off the war in Iraq. Now, it should also be mentioned that Salman bin Laden tragically died the same way his father did in a Cessna plane over Texas,
Hmm.
which that had nothing to do with the Bush family or American intelligence, trust me.
To
So,
quote Vladimir Putin, that sounds like tragic circumstance.
yeah, it was probably Putin who did it while he was mayor of St. Petersburg or something.
Oh, of course. Why
Um,
wouldn't that's the logical conclusion. You got to trust our intelligence agencies.
yeah, so you know, there's all these nefarious ties, and Khashoggi was just a basic neoliberal stooge. I mean, even what's happening now, a lot of it is just a kind of part of it is the cultural divide that's happening in the US. The part of the left wants to capitalize this in order to criticize Trump because that's literally something that they will have to do until Trump is no longer in office. So that's predictable. However, the family he has strong ties to American intelligence himself. And so this is a spat, the way I see it, it's a spat within the empire, within Global Homo itself. Um, but it's going to have, and I think you'll agree with me, I think this is where you're going, it's going to have much more higher reaching effects. And
Yeah, because
we're,
even if
we're
the
going to
U.S.
see
government
that.
doesn't act on it, a lot of these U.S. companies are, which is going to be enough to at least make Saudi Arabia feel some pain. Which I think because I didn't know actually any of this what you said because we usually know what we're going to talk about before the show, but this is actually all new information to me, and all I can do is honestly I can laugh. All I can do is chuckle at this because it's not a surprise. Since I didn't think this guy was some stellar individual to begin with. Of course, I don't believe he deserved to be assassinated, nor do I condone what Saudi Arabia does. I think everyone here knows that. But it's just hilarious hearing all of that and thinking, oh yeah, this is over because he disagreed with the current administration in charge of Saudi Arabia. Not that he didn't agree with their goals overall, but I do want to continue. Actually, another interesting thing that seems a bit unrelated is Turkey's role in this. Now, I do have a feeling, seeing as the assassination happened in Turkey, Erdogan knows something that the rest of the world does not, and will use it as a bargaining chip to try to mend relations with the U.S., try to play both sides. He's courted the Russians. He's probably going to try to court us again. Now, this is also compounded. The reason I believe this is Pastor Brunson, which we talked about almost 2 months ago at this point, was also released, which may have been something of an olive branch from Erdogan to the U.S.
Um, Yeah, I think Erdogan is. Although I think Erdogan is going to take a bit of a back seat to the Khashoggi thing, but he's also going to do that for the Brunson pastor. It's amazing that Brunson is released now. I guess Erdogan caved.
Yeah, basically, he did it in a very diplomatic way. They gave him time served because they said, "Oh, you get 3 years in prison, but we've been holding you for that long, so go on, get out of here." But yeah, I'm not too surprised that he caved. I knew that he was gonna, but honestly, I figured he would have waited sooner to the point where he could have actually gotten something of the U.S. in exchange for him. I figured that's the game he was trying to play. But again, he's released. But I do have a feeling this may be related to the Khashoggi thing in terms of, oh, look, here's a gesture of goodwill. Now you'll believe me when I tell you the story that our intelligence agencies know. Now, the U.S. has
Mm.
also been reluctant to take any action against Saudi Arabia. Trump has said he wants to wait for evidence before taking any action, unlike the Syria strikes, apparently. But though frustrating, I can understand Trump's motives and where he's coming from. He doesn't want oil and gas prices to skyrocket by entering a key member of OPEC. Trump is in a very precarious situation, as he almost always is, as the president of the United States almost always is. A lot of people, a lot of the neocons want him to outright strike Saudi Arabia, which I think is funny. It's like, after all these years, now you want to take action against Saudi Arabia. Okay, yeah, let's not talk about that. But and then you also have a lot of the lefties saying, "Oh, Trump colludes with Saudi Arabia because the Russian collusion narrative has basically died at this point." But I think it's funny that they want Trump to take this rash action. Now, if they did take this rash action, and Saudi Arabia retaliated by raising oil and gas prices, they would call Trump unhinged and say went headfirst into this
Yeah,
and rose
exactly.
gas prices. So, no matter what action Trump took, he couldn't win here. And I think he went with the wiser option, despite me ideologically disagreeing with it. I can understand the practicality of it.
Right. And like I say, there may be some sort of unsavory ties that are revealed the longer that people dwell on this.
Yeah, and
Um,
honestly, it's been here for a while, so this story's sticking around a lot longer than I thought it would. It's probably going to stick around longer than probably even this week.
yeah, and I think that this also sets in motion something else, and that is the so-called Arab NATO that was supposed to have come together. I think that this recent rift, we'll see how far the rift goes, but
Yeah, and
recent rift
another
with
thing to consider is you haven't heard a thing about Iran since Trump's side comments at the UN, in which could you really consider that? I mean, that was basically pandering, but when was the last time you heard anything serious about the Iranians?
right. Yeah, I think Iran is rightfully enjoying all of this. They're having a good time with it. I know I am.
I mean, the
Um,
world's shifting. Nobody cares about Iran, as we're going to get into. People care about Russia less, and I mean, I expected, of course, a lot more pain to be felt. I didn't expect like a major war, but I did expect something to come out of this before the world order shifted. But again, it took the death of a neoliberal stooge journalist in order to bring on the shift. And frankly, all I can do, like I said, all I can do is laugh.
yeah, yeah. Like I say, it's a kind of infighting. The longer they hold on to it, the more unsavory details are going to emerge. If that's the game that they're willing to play, well, the Democrats have been playing that game for about 2 years now,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
and they're welcome to it. It just for me, it just shows a kind of impotency.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
it's basically showing, yeah, that empires impotent. They can't even get along with each other. They can't even unite to fight whatever boogeyman they've built up today.
Right. I mean, journalists have disappeared in Turkey all the time. I mean, this isn't unusual. So why is it so important now?
Yeah, and they always hammer Putin, because he supposedly just has death camps for journalists. I mean, that if you believe the media narrative, you think it's a weekly ritual that they sacrifice a journalist to appease whatever god they believe in. But my point being is, yeah, this happens all the time in a lot worse places, and this is all just very interesting, and is basically showing what is to come out of the world order. Now, just in closing, I do believe by pressure alone, the U.S. government will be forced to punish Saudi Arabia in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just something symbolic, even if it's just like a slight sanction. I mean, you already have U.S. companies and like power players and billionaires and millionaires in the U.S. punishing them, but I think the U.S. government will have to slap some sanction on them before this is all said and done. I mean, I can laugh at that, but I don't expect anything too significant. Now, this outrage, like I said, has lasted much longer than I expected, which signals, even if not by the United States government, Saudi Arabia will face retaliation, as they already have, for their actions. Not only about this, but you see a lot of people talking about Yemen afterwards. They say, oh, you think this is bad? Look at what they're doing in Yemen. Look what they've been doing for 2 years. And they're not even
Mhm.
doing it as a wedge against Trump. They're doing it, they're saying, oh, yeah, it started in 2015. This has nothing to do with the U.S. This is what they're doing. So
This
it's,
could be
it's,
4D chess by Trump.
I mean,
Literally.
yeah, I wouldn't doubt at this point. He's surprised me with more and less in the past. So anything could happen. But let's dive right into China, because there's quite a bit of news about China. Now, I was actually watched this a few hours before the show started, and it's another piece from the Caspian report, which I said I cannot recommend enough. They put our work to shame. I mean, uh, yeah, I'll link this afterwards since I can't do it right now. But in short, what it described is it called China's diplomacy checkbook diplomacy. It was basically China playing the role of a loan shark to the developing world. Now, especially after Western economies have been shaken in 2008, this is what I got from the video. China has moved into the developing world with investment and loan offers. Now, China will walk them into a debt trap, which basically, I mean, pretty self-explanatory, but what it is, you get them in so much debt they have no choice but to turn to you for debt relief or some other concession they can give you. And smaller nations would then pay off China either with resources or access to ports or other natural resources or anything else the country has to offer. Now, another thing what China is doing is they are expanding their maritime power, mainly in shipping, which is kind of a prelude to they're going to expand their naval power further down the road. Which what they're trying to do is they're trying to get maritime positions along what they call the string of pearls in the Indian Ocean. And this circumvents the U.S.'s massive presence in the Pacific. Now, of course, the U.S. Navy has a massive presence everywhere, but especially in the Pacific, if you're getting my point, they're still in the Indian Ocean, but nothing, like I said, the Pacific is probably the biggest presence we have in terms of the Navy. Now, based on this and its increased cooperation with Pakistan, it looks like China is trying to encircle India before they can really present a true challenge to them, as we've suspected on this program. Now, the matter does further complicate when you consider the Russian Indian relationship and how that's forming. While Putin's recent visit, as you said, was probably to smooth things out with the arms sale and try to bring India into their fold, I think the relationship between India and China will only get worse, which is going to put Russia in a very, very awkward situation. And we also have to consider when it comes to Russian Chinese cooperation, it mainly begins and ends with opposition to U.S. hegemony.
Right. I, on on the one hand, I think China is maybe overreacting in the sense that although yes, it's understandable China wants the string of pearls, it wants a greater naval presence for its trade and so on. It is, however, still trying to develop the Silk Road, which I don't see China. Sorry, I don't see India as like as an obstacle or there's an obstruction to it. It'll have to be a contributor because it's on the road. So I would think maybe because India has better ties with America overall, maybe that's why China is acting preemptively. But at the moment, as it stands now, India is very far away from being able to challenge China economically. Like it's several generations away.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
they're basically what China was in the '90s, if you ask me, if even.
I would say even 80s. Or like yeah, I don't think that and I don't know if India is going to be able to rise to that level simply because India is faced with more challenges internally and externally.
I'm surprised the country isn't splintered, and with the growing diversity in the country, you're probably going to see a lot of ethnic and religious conflicts. Not even violent, but just a lot of division in the country of India, which is
Yeah.
either going to push it into the American sphere or it's going to push it into the Russo-Chinese sphere as long as that one lasts, which basically will devolve in the Chinese sphere as Russia loses interest in that area in particular. Which, just going on is uh, now, to bolster my theory of that, I think there's going to be more of a rift between Russia and China in the coming years. Is Russia did come out in support of the Belt Road Initiative, which basically trying to rebuild the Silk Road, as we discussed. They'll likely change their tone when China is firmly in Central Asia, aka Russia's backyard. Now, as we've discussed, yeah, I don't think Russia. I mean, they don't like the U.S. presence there, despite their better relationship with China. I think after a while it'll probably get to them. Maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I think it's still kind of early to tell. I think ideally Russia would want both India and China to get along. Ideally, that's ideal, I think, for Russia, considering what they want to accomplish. As a great, Eurasian plain power, it cannot afford to have. It needs both as friends, not one as a super friend and the other one as an adversary.
Yeah, I have a feeling that
Long term, that's not going to work. Um, so it remains to be seen. I think like when I was in Russia, the impression like I actually spoke with some Indian students who were there, and there's Chinese students as well, and both of them see themselves as sort of friendly towards the Russian sphere and so on. Um, Although I would say culturally, by a small margin, China is considered to be more within that sphere, more cooperative at the moment than India. However, overall, Indian and Russian relations historically have been better with far fewer road bumps.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the Soviet Union that was the main supporter of Indian independence from the British.
Right, and even prior to that, when with the British Empire, when it
Yeah.
was controlling India, so they've always had a very good relationship with India, generally better than they've had with China.
Yeah, they've actually had some blood with China in the past, which, like I said,
Yeah.
their relationship with China now is marriage convenience. But just on the Russian point, I've been meaning to discuss this. I've been waiting for the right topic, but I figured I'd just shoehorn this in here. We look at Russia, despite the fear mongering from the neoconservatives and the mainstream media, they want to paint them like Putin's trying to rebuild the Soviet Union and become the world power. But what Russia wants is they basically want that layer of security when it comes to like buffer zones, having allies within Europe and in Asia. But and you also look at it in terms of economic growth. I don't think the Russians are actually too concerned with economic growth. So their economy is only about the size of Italy's. If Russia was concerned about economic growth, Putin would just go full neoliberal and kiss the ring of the West, and he could be on top of the world right now. But I don't think he wants that. I think he wants the economy stable enough to keep the Russian nation to survive until this world order can collapse, so he can actually preserve what the Russian nation is about culturally. And that's my working theory, at least.
Yeah, and I would agree with you on that. Also, uh, the Russian people, anyways, like they strongly identify with their culture, and the vast majority don't want any liberal policies. I mean, when I was there, even like hipster types are kind of shocked when you tell them about who the the goings on, like a 9-year old drag queen, super fierce boy, like this kind of stuff is absolutely jolting to them. They can't even fathom how like the West can sink to this. So I think for them also, yeah, I agree with you. The culture is a bedrock, and part of Putin's power comes from being able to appeal to the middle and lower classes and their need to preserve the culture and the religion, as opposed to the liberal elites of Russia who want to see themselves get richer. Uh, so I mean that in itself is a very it's a very interesting move because a lot of countries wouldn't have done that, and it kind of sort of fits the it being a no, it doesn't matter if whether Russia was ever an empire or not. That can all be considered like something premature. It still is a kind of a youthful nation in the sense that it doesn't think as materially as the West does.
Yeah, I
Its
mean,
notions about what its culture and its identity is more historically rooted. It's not abstracted the way it is in the West. But the West wasn't like that either. It took centuries to get here.
absolutely. But the reason I mentioned this, and just to go like I said, Russia mainly they just want to preserve their existence, and that's their main goal here. Because if they wanted to be a world power, they'd go with the Chinese model by kissing the neoliberal world order's ring and waiting 20 years until they had that kind of power to actually start becoming and doing what China does. That's if Russia wanted to do that, they very well could. But like I said, I think they just want to preserve their existence as a culture. And that being said, them wanting to be a regional power at best is going to make them a good mediator between the Indians and the Chinese. That was what I was trying to get to with the whole tangent.
Yeah, I thought that was an excellent point. That is, it's just something that people rarely ever mention. That it's always been the suspicion that he's going to, like you said, recreate the Soviet. Erdogan is going to create the Ottoman Empire again, and it's just a lot of it is just a lot of projection. I think it comes out of like the West kind of years, kind of feeling of this a project. All these other players are rid of the fact it's just gonna take. It doesn't happen that fast.
Yeah, just to let you know, you're fine now, but you robot a little there. But yeah, honestly,
Okay.
I think the people like fantasizing like, oh, Erdogan's gonna be the new Sultan or Putin's gonna recreate the Soviet Union. I think it also just goes to show the failures of neoliberalism that multipolarism is the natural state of the world, that they want a big enemy they can stand up against.
Right.
Which I think it's funny because they're the neoliberals, but then they just go to prove our point. But I did want to get into a bit more about China, just related to the
Mhm.
U.S.-Chinese relations. Now, I would say Cold War II is officially on, and as we discussed last week, in the eye, all eyes, including the eyes of the swamp, are on the Chinese. Russia seems to be a complete afterthought at this point. When was the last time you heard anything about the Russian collusion, Russian meddling, or anything like that?
Yeah, it's been several weeks.
Yeah, I mean, again, and you have Mike Pence last week saying Russian collusion, Russian meddling pales in comparison to what China does. I mean, you have basically one of their own coming out and saying that. Like I said, I think they've been forced to address it because they kicked the can down the road so far. But uh,
Could I
the
add
main,
just one little thing? Could
yeah,
I
go
add
on.
just one little thing? I don't know if most of our listeners are aware, but at this present moment, the head of Interpol, this is the international police, is being detained in China. Just think about that. Like all this going on about Khashoggi, 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 I'm not trying to minimize it or be glib about it, but Interpol is a pretty important organization, and its head is being detained right now in China.
Yeah, I mean, one of the few globalist organizations that actually functions properly and does a good job at what it's supposed to do. But
Yeah,
yeah, that I didn't know that, but that's insane. But like I said, the establishment's kicked the can down the road so far with China that they have no choice but to address it. Now, Trump came out in a bit of a stunning move, if you weren't paying attention, and announced that he wants to leave the Universal Postal Union Treaty, which has basically allowed China and other upcoming nations to sell goods to the U.S. with drastically lower shipping rates in order to help develop their economies. Now, this treaty was signed back in 1874. That's as far back as it goes. Now, this actually wouldn't be the first challenge to this treaty. Obama actually pushed for a renegotiation in 2016 and did get a few concessions. Now, with Trump announcing his withdrawal of it, the treaty rules dictate that there will be a year period to enter negotiations to try to work out whatever issues what country is leaving it has. And that also goes to bolster the theory that with tensions rising between the U.S. and China, it is speculated that Trump will be having a sideline meeting with Z or she. I'm not. I'm actually not sure how it's pronounced. I've heard both, but at next month's G20 summit. So that would bolster because if they're scrapping it, there has to be that year period of negotiation. And there's been talks that they're going to meet already. It wouldn't be the first time they've met. They've actually, despite our rocky relationship with China, which was actually pretty good in 2017 when they thought they could manipulate Trump. Trump has met with the president of China several times, both over there in foreign countries and in the U.S. I mean, Trump's first visit with a foreign leader was him, and they were at Mar-a-Lago. So I
yeah,
I,
that's
I
right. I
think that
remember
just
that.
yeah, taking the president of China golfing. There's nothing more Trump like.
Oh, yeah.
But I would say between the two, I would say they have a very good frenemy relationship. If you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Um, it's going to be interesting the next time they meet after the last 6 months or so. Uh,
Because they haven't met since Singapore, in which they weren't the main focus of that.
right. Yeah, I don't know what will happen. There could be an immediate concession, although I doubt it because China is not Turkey, and like as I said earlier, if they can detain the head of Interpol, then they have a lot more power than we would otherwise presume.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, at this point, I don't even care about the trade war. I just care about not subsidizing China and their expansionism, and that's a direct threat to us. So again, I'm willing to pay the higher prices for consumer goods, so long as we're not bolstering the Chinese. But just another interesting move in this whole new Cold War developing in Asia. On top of all this, China is now trying to court Australia after a fire exchange of words back when the U.S. and the Chinese navies had their close calls. And they're basically doing the business to business partnership where they're trying to get Chinese businesses to cooperate with Australian businesses. Now, this is on top of Chinese nationals basically buying up all the real estate in all the major urban areas in Australia. Not only Australia, but several places in the Western world. I think Seattle's another big one. Vancouver, definitely. They do this, of course, all across the world, but mainly they're trying to chip away at the Anglosphere by just controlling their land, by buying it.
Right. Right. It's a slow, gradual thing, and there's a lot of people in the West that are completely compliant to it. We have Vancouver, you guys have Feinstein, but the list goes on. Um, and it's tragic because it has so many negative consequences for us down the road. Um, and it makes, I think, it makes acting, uh, in unison, as an Anglo culture, much much more difficult, because it's a compromise.
Oh
And
yeah, I would definitely agree. But just on the topic of, I guess you could call it China's real estate colonization, because apparently they just want to colonize everything. You had liberals making jokes about this 10 years ago, but now if you suggest that, you're the worst person in the world. It's funny to watch just how
good point.
they've completely switched off their brains. Like, because at the very least, they always did play the neoliberal game, but they at least had some resistance to it. But it's gotten to the point where they just completely parroted it. But again, I remember, like, 2007, 2008, they would make jokes about, like, oh, China's going to own us in 10 years. Oh, China's going to do this and that. Oh, we need to free Tibet. But now all of a sudden you're racist or whatever buzzword they have for you if you say those things.
Screw Tibet, free China. It's amazing. It's amazing. I remember all the all the concerts for Tibet and everything, and it's all just gone away. And now it's arguments about, But I like the pickle particularly of affirmative action in universities. Chinese groups and individuals suing Harvard, for instance, for their diversity quotas for the university programs because they discriminate far more against the Chinese. So it's a wild time, and it's amazing. There's all these new pivot points that the left won't touch.
Yeah, they won't even talk about the Uyghurs, wherever the Muslim group is in China, which you figured they'd be all over that, but no.
Yeah,
They side with the Chinese more than they side with Islam, which is, if you've been paying attention to the modern left over the past few years, it's actually a bit surprising to see that. But beyond all that, beyond the China talk, again, the news just gets, I would say, better and better there. Now, again, I do feel a bit hawkish, but I think that's only the proper response to China with the way they've been behaving and the way we've built them up. But again, it's been all very interesting to watch pretty much the world turn against them, almost to the degree, not almost to the degree of Saudi Arabia, but you see a lot of these Southeast Asian countries coming out, canceling Chinese infrastructure projects. You see a lot of African countries declining to get into them. You basically see a bunch of desperate nations looking for a loan shark, which, as I said at the top of when we started discussing this, turn to China.
yeah. I don't know what to add to that. I mean, I the Economist did for decades. It did this sort of, it would project for the next year what will happen, and it did several stories about the coming vice, and it literally dates back to the late '80s, early '90s about an inevitable conflict between America and China, or between the West and China. So it's really interesting seeing that happen now. I remember particularly around between 2010 and 2012, 13, kind of reading up on this and taking this a bit more seriously. And really in geopolitical terms, 5, 6 years down the road for this to become like an everyday reality where it's spoken about on the news on a daily basis and sanctions and so on, really makes you believe like there is, the potential for a conflict
Oh
of,
yeah,
some
I
kind.
definitely agree. But like, we actually got into this a few weeks ago. Number one, it's not going to be anytime in the near future. We're still way too intertwined, despite the deterioration of relations. And number two on that point is it's really going to be the first major fourth generation warfare type of war, which is going to be very different than what anything we've seen in the past. Because in the past, you think Generation 3, which would be like World War II, even to an extent something like Vietnam, you have either guerrilla forces fighting a conventional force or conventional forces fighting like guerrilla forces, or two major armies, for example, in the case of World War II, the Korean War, facing each other on the battlefield. But no, you're going to see countries using their militaries to aid different ethnic and religious and other cultural groups to fight against each other to the point where they can have limited engagement but still be waging all-out war on each other. So it's going to be something to see. It's not going to be pretty, but it's going to be something.
Yeah, I would say the right wing never Trumpers and the Democrats are they're more or less on the side of China.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
They're completely they're I mean financially they're wedded to them, but also for those on the lower caste system of the left, um, China is viewed, or at least Chinese individuals can be viewed as victims. Even the way Chinese and Asians have been voting in America historically changed in the 2000s. It was for the first time ever now that they vote Democrat rather than Republican. And I think a lot of reasons why libs and Dems don't see the contradiction when you compare like 2008 to 2018, with reference, for instance, to Tibet and so on, is I think subconsciously or semi-consciously, I think they understand that their order of the world is deeply tied into China. And if the West in the next 20 years sees civil wars going on, it this will be one of the reasons because of this inability to resolve and sever ties, especially financially and ideologically.
oh yeah, I mean, I actually cracked a joke about this. Eventually we're going to see China funding both La Raza and white identitarian groups as the West tears itself apart.
Hmm. Exactly. That's what I was getting at.
Yeah, yeah, but it's all very just interesting. But I do want to close up the show, get that strong last streak, which we always like to get, and talk about a bit of the lead up into the Brazil elections, which are about 2 weeks away, a week and a half away at this point now. The neoliberal world order has basically admitted their defeat in Brazil, and many of the propaganda outlets are even coming out and saying they're running headlines like "Why Brazil's far-right challenger has already won," and just stuff like that, basically conceding that they've lost. Now, to tie back to the previous topic, Bolsonaro has pleased me even more and has come out against the Chinese and Chinese influence, stating that China is buying Brazil. That's another one they've had a lot of investments in. Now, political violence has also been very much on the rise in Brazil, which I predicted when I actually did my initial video about the assassination attempt on Bolsonaro almost about a month ago at this point.
Yeah.
Now, there has allegedly been a serious assault committed by supporters of Bolsonaro against leftists. Now, while I can grant this may be true and probably is true, based on Brazil's political climate and the political climate of Latin America in general, I suspect the inverse is much more true at a higher rate.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in most cases. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, but again, I'm not saying either side is going to come out with no blood on their hands on this. Like I said, no matter what happens, especially if Bolsonaro wins, which it's looking like it's probably going to be just short of civil war. Now, I may be exaggerating it a bit here, but they're going to be street fights. It's going to make things like Charlottesville and what happens in Portland every once in a while look like child's play. I said this before, but it's
Right, and the
very
EU
interesting.
is getting in on it too.
Yeah.
The EU is funding groups to go in to dissuade people from voting for the next term of votes against Bolsonaro, and there's even I think there's a couple of gay American actors who are going down to protest as well. So you can tell that I mean, what does this have to do with their native countries? It doesn't. You can tell like Global Homo is really trying their very best right now to stop this from happening. I think they understand in just how connected the world is, that his victory will have a profound effect on their countries as well. So, I mean, I can see strategically why they're doing it.
Oh
But it's
yeah.
for me, it's just a funny contrast compared to 2011 with the whole Arab Spring, how it was going to revolutionize the Middle East.
Oh, the Middle East is going to become neoliberal democracy. It's going to happen this time. I mean, they only rejected it in the 70s, but let's just ignore that. But the funny thing is, just about all of this is I saw some pieces trying to say, oh, he's just like the neoliberal, so there's no point in voting for him. It just shows how these people can't keep their narrative straight. They say, oh, he's just one of us, while also fear mongering how bad he is. They did this with Trump. They did this in the lead up to Brexit vote. They did this with all these types of moves, saying, "Oh, it's not going to make a difference," but we're still afraid of them because reasons.
Yeah, yeah. I think deep down inside, what the like, I mean, I understand why this is tempting for some people, especially like if you're coming from a libertarian background, and your whole argument, your whole viewpoint of the world is about power and the relationship between those who have power and those who don't. But the truth is, hierarchy is never going to go away, and it's a young man's obsession to look at the world in such a narrow view. I mean, yes, the world is about power and people who have power and those who do not. And yes, it's hierarchical, and that isn't always pleasant for the vast majority of people. But the point is, uh, you can have somebody within that hierarchy that represents you better than someone else.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I think it was actually during the Trump Putin summit episode. You said, "Look, they're all going to be gangsters. You got to find the gangster who's going to stand up for your country at the very least."
that's right. That's right. I mean, if you're going to be ruled by a mafia, make sure it's your own. That's just a fact. And like we mentioned earlier tonight, Putin's power rests in his ability to please the vast majority of Russians. Like if if he veered off that course, he wouldn't have any popularity. If he adopted some kind of a repackaging of the neoliberal order from Yeltsin with I don't know, some kind of new Western branding, um, he's not going to convince them. So power is always relational. You're not going to, it's not symmetrical, but it is relational.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people talk about like, "Oh, we need democracy because you need to hold your government to account." Well, it gets to the point where just you have these authoritarian regimes. I mean, because that's what they are. I'm not saying that's good or bad inherently. It's up to each country to decide its own fate. But they still have to rule with the consent of the people. I mean, look how many tyrants have been beheaded and replaced with another tyrant. Again, they still implement the same form of government, but they say, "You're ineffective at this. We're getting somebody else to do it. You're either going to step down, you're going to abdicate, or you're going to get in the guillotine." I mean, that's basically what the French Revolution was. It was, I mean, again, they didn't get their democracy right away, but that's an entire topic for a different day. But
Yes.
yeah, it's very interesting because a lot of people, I think it's a very Western view to think that, oh, if it's not a liberal democracy where anyone and everyone can vote, it's an oppressive regime that needs to be deposed of.
Right, right. As if everybody voting is the surest way to prevent oligarchs from taking over your country. I mean, that the last 30, 40 years proves that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, look at the growth of government, and the expansion of voting rights in the U.S. I mean, look at when we started getting the NSA, CIA. I mean, that all happened when everyone could vote. But I'm not here to bash on democracy. I'm here to talk about world affairs right now. So we're going to get into just the chaos involving the European Union because it has been hilarious, and it's also hilarious to watch the reactions to it. And the Italian government still continues to please and live up to what they say they're going to do. Now, to nobody's surprise, neoliberal Napoleon, aka Emmanuel Macron, does not have a favorable view of the current Italian government. Now, on Monday, the French actually went as far as to dump a policeman full of migrants over the Italian border. The French did not deny this, but instead they called it a simple mistake. Now, Salvini was quick to fire back, saying, quote, "Abandoning immigrants in an Italian forest cannot be considered a mistake or an incident." He continued by saying, "We are faced with an international shame, and Mr. Macron cannot pretend that nothing has happened. We don't accept this apology." Oh, boy.
It's just outrageous. What does he think he's going to achieve by this? He's only going to strengthen Italy, sort of dividing itself, moving away from France and Britain. To me, if I could be mistaken, but to me, it seems like Italy and Germany right now are forming, as far as like countries that are what I would consider really Western, rather than being a part of the Western bloc. Most of the nationalist groups are forming right now. Um, France had a go at it some years back, but the resilience is starting to show itself more in Germany and Italy, and Salvini is not backing down. He's been quite stalwart and matter of fact, very much like Orban. So this is going to fail. Macron's move is going to fail.
Oh yeah, I mean, his own people don't like him, and the rest of the world doesn't seem to be his biggest fan. I mean, you remember back in May when Macron was trying to convince Trump to stay in the Iran deal, just how that meeting went, how he basically just drag him around and say, "Okay, you're going to do this." Again, that's how the world views Macron. Nobody respects him. Like nobody
Yeah,
except maybe
except
Theresa
for his
May.
geriatric Barbie wife.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah. I mean, not French colonies. Like, do you remember when he went? I think it was back in August. These two guys wanted to get a picture with him, and they were basically half naked.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like on one of the like airfields in South Pacific or whatever. But to
Oh
continue with
God.
what I was saying, recent spat and ongoing, as I called, war of words between the Italian and the French as the relationship rapidly deteriorates. Now, I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here. This may be a bit of an exaggeration. It may not be this bad. The way I see it is this is probably one of the most sour relationships between European countries since before the Second World War.
Yeah. Sorry, you
Uh,
were cutting out a
but
little bit.
it continues. Not only does France have to uh, knock down the Italians, not only did they back then.
Sorry, lads. He'll be right back. We always have this little bit of a cutout. Mine too, sometimes. There we go.
Hello,
Yep, you're
hello.
back. Yep, you're good.
It wouldn't be the war report without a technical difficulty. Now, it actually took a while for that one to come in, so I'm a bit pleased on that one at least. But like I said, this is probably one of the most rapidly deteriorating relationships between European countries. Now, UK also felt the need to get on this, at least the UK media. Their absolute joke of the media from their absolute joke of the country took a short break from warmongering after the Russians and advocating for the decline of their own country in other ways, with the outlet The Independent claiming, quote, before our eyes, Italy's state.
Sorry, repeat that
I
again?
mean, frankly, I think it's hilarious to say this about countries that have actually pushed these ideologies, but the Independent, the UK media, that Italy is becoming a very eyes. Put out again? Did I go quiet?
Yeah, I can hear you now. You were cutting out.
Okay, my apologies about the technics episode, but as I was saying, the Independent, which the UK news outlet called Italy a fascist state and said they're becoming a fascist state before our very eyes.
Yeah, like more and more people don't care anymore. That word is thrown out so often now. Deep down, I think there's an immense fear that the European Union is going to break up. I think.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Oh
Sorry.
yeah, I mean the European Union it's a vestige of the old world order that is bound to come undone eventually. And frankly, I agree. And I think it's funny that they usually try to use this fascist slur against countries that haven't experienced it or actually had it as a form of government at some point in the past. But the Italians, yeah, I mean, we all know they were once a fascist country, and actual literal fascism. They called themselves fascists. So yeah,
Yeah, and
it's been interesting that they're trying the tactics here. I mean, uh, like I said, they mainly try this in America, the UK, France, countries where they never had a fascist government power that wasn't imposed on them by conquest. At least in the case of France. But
I
I
mean
mean,
I mean, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, the catchword has been, to watch out for fascism within the EU. Said if it weren't for the EU, uh, there would just be another, World War III in Europe would occur again, and it would be another fight between the fascists and the liberal.
yeah, because I don't know why the obsession with this world order is to glorify the previous world order. Because I don't know, I wasn't alive at the time, but did after the Napoleonic Wars, did they call people the next Napoleon? I'm honestly not sure whether they did or not, because that would actually be interesting to know.
Well, I think the the liberal theory goes that any kind of nationalism will eventually lead to war. You don't want war, do you? So that's the way it works. Um, the only way they feel they can solve this riddle is by having a superstate, and
Yeah,
that dissolves nationalities and therefore rivalries.
but just on the topic of the UK, I just wanted to discuss, speaking of the European Union, UK. There's been more breakthrough on the Brexit negotiations, if you could call it that. So, speaking of the joke of the country, the UK, Prime Minister Theresa May met with several leaders of European Union countries and several European Union officials in Brussels for Brexit negotiations. Now, to no one's surprise, Theresa May came out looking weak and ineffective. Now, regardless of the outcome of the negotiations, what we do have to consider is the UK will officially leave the Union on the 29th of March 2019, just shy of 3 years after the initial vote. Now, May will also be having separate meetings at different times with EU Council President Donald Tusk, of all people, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, fan favorite of the show, and Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar. I believe that's how his name is pronounced, but I'm not entirely sure. Now, it's also suspected that the UK will remain in the EU markets until December 2020, but it's also speculated that it will not be enough time for the UK to arrange itself in terms of trade agreements, whether it be within the European Union or outside the European Union, for their economy to remain stable. So, again, it was something that needed to happen, Brexit, but it was sabotaged by people, again, like Theresa May. And it's honestly, I feel bad for the British people considering the fact it should have been a very simple thing. They should have voted to leave, gotten a rudimentary deal hammered out. I mean, hell, they should have went to outside powers. They should have gone to the United States or their former Commonwealth countries to hammer out their economic ties, and pretty much should have isolated themselves as the European Union. Not entirely, but again, I am of the opinion that people like Theresa May, who want to remain, deliberately sabotage this and is not just incompetent. Now, that being said, I think Theresa May is incompetent in plenty of ways, but I think when it comes to Brexit negotiations, I think she was a saboteur.
Yeah, I agree. From the onset, this was not the result that they wanted. The EU has a record of not respecting results they don't want. It's been tragic to watch, honestly. Um, hopefully Britain will be able to leave. I mean, I see some progress in terms of wanting to strike up deals with China. However, that could be a kind of a maneuvering that would happen anyways, regardless of whether they stayed or didn't. But yeah, May is a particularly loathsome politician.
Yeah, I mean, the point where I know Boris Johnson basically, he's pretty much an American neoconservative in terms of policy, but I think honestly anyone would do a better job than what Theresa May could give you. And that's honestly why I think the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn in particular, they're going to win the next election because Corbyn, as much as he may say some things that are just harebrained or memeish, or how he may be called like, oh, all these things by the media, at the end of the day, what he still represents that pushback against neoliberalism worldwide. And even if it's a hardcore lefty like Corbyn, I think I'd rather have someone like that in charge than someone like May.
Yeah, I agree. Corbyn is also possibly Nazbol, but no, in all
We, we,
seriousness,
we can only wish.
we
We
can
can
only
only.
wait. He is an old-fashioned leftist in that regard.
I mean, he's also a protectionist, which also helps in that regard too.
Yeah, yeah. We definitely have more in common on some grounds with him than we do with neoliberals.
Yeah, I like I said, I honestly I think a lot of what he does will harm the UK, but I don't think what I'm trying to say is it can't be any worse than the trajectory that they're on now.
Yeah, yeah,
So
I'll agree with that.
even as someone with as ardent right wing views as mine, if I were a British citizen, I'd actually be voting Labour, believe it or not. Now, I did want to close out the show with a bit of a different topic. I addressed this yesterday. I decided to go into further detail on it, but that is the migrant caravan. Now, you'll remember this happened also about 6 months ago, back in I believe it was April. A migrant caravan of about 1,500 people at that time was heading towards the U.S. border. Now, they were mostly dissipated because Trump put pressure on Mexico to dissipate them. Those ones are mainly coming from El Salvador, but traveling through Mexico, of course, just geographically. This one coming now is approximately 1,300 people, and they are traveling from Honduras to the United States. Now, a lot of the liberals will say, "Oh, we need to be generous. We need to take them in. They're just poor. They're trying to make a better life." And a lot of the conservatives will say, "Oh, they're just coming to take advantage of the system," which I will grant is partially true. But what both of them seem to be missing is what is happening here is you have the governments of these Central American nations going around finding the dregs of society, the absolute worst people of their societies, and push them northward. Basically, what Castro did during the Cuban boat lift in 1980. He took his entire prisons and he just threw them at Florida and said, "Sort it out, U.S., have fun." And that's basically what these Central American countries have been doing for a sustained period of time. It wasn't a one-off thing. The Cuban boat lift wasn't ideal, but it's not like Castro did it every year or every 6 months.
Yeah, it does. It feels like it's every year, every 6 months, there's another wave and another wave and another wave. And honestly, how long can this go on? I mean, it really, from the outside, this looks like a country in the throes of suicide. There is no long-term planning. I remember a year ago, I was having a very poignant discussion with a friend of mine who he's from Europe as well. He's a Hungarian, and he was talking about the migrant crisis there in sort of lambasting Hungary. And I said, well, such and such number of millions have come in. How many more do you think should come in? And he just sort of froze. He had, I said, you don't even know. You don't know. You don't know how many more. You don't even know if it should ever stop. You have no answers for any of this. And that's what it feels like when you're looking at our own political elites. They're so wedded to this idea of like a super idea of equality that nothing can stand in the way of it. No laws, no regional concern, only that everyone is equal all the time, and and that we have to accept them. You
Yeah,
know,
I definitely, I have no additions to that point besides the fact that I couldn't have said it better myself. But the thing is about this caravan is Trump is aware of it. He's made several statements about it. But the main thing which I like that he threatened to do is he threatened to cut off aid and financial support to countries that do this because he knows, and I mean, I imagine every U.S. president knows, but he's the first one to address it, that it is a program run by their governments where they take the worst of their society and basically expel them. So I would say uh, this is actually an argument in favor of foreign aid, at least for countries that are your neighbors and within your sphere of influence. So I don't support as much as we give them now, but I still support keeping them on somewhat of financial lease, these countries in Central America and these countries in South America, because again, it gives us leverage over it whenever they try to do things like this.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Yeah. Considering what the state of American politics now, it's probably the best recourse we have is to make them tied to money, tied to aid rather, and being able to shut that off. It's the only kind of leverage we have at the moment.
yeah, and I mean to basically tie this back around to earlier topics, it also helps keep Chinese influence out to an extent. I know they're encroaching,
Mm.
but again, every little bit helps. So again, that's actually my argument in favor of foreign aid for once. But yeah, I'm glad the issue is being addressed. I think it's probably going to end similar to the last one, where Mexico is eventually forced to dissipate it and send them back, or at least keep some of them there. But again, this is also right before the midterm elections. They're 20 days away now. And this is probably going to bolster the Republican base after, I would say, several domestic victories, especially the Kavanaugh one. Foreign
I agree.
policy victories, mainly the North Korea issue. As much as I disagree with it, getting out of the Iran deal was popular amongst amongst a lot of Americans, even independents. So, yeah, this is going to be a political wedge. Again, it should be. But all I can say is, if we're not going to build the wall, we need to at least take our troops out of these hellhole places we have them now and have them patrol the border like every other sane country does.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's all the topics I have for today. So unless you have any further comment on that, I gotta take the show to a close.
No, that's about it for me too.
So thank you all for tuning in. It's been quite the show. Very interesting topics from beginning to the end. Very fast one today. I know I say that a lot, but a lot of viewers turned up. It's nice to see those big crowds getting into the double
Yeah, thanks,
digits.
guys.
um, of course, we'll be here next week, either Wednesday or Thursday, based on our previous track record. But we will see you guys then. I'll keep the regular content out on my channel. All our links are down in the description below. My Twitter, the War Report Twitter, GSP's Twitter, all my other alternative social medias. So if you want to find any of us anywhere outside the channel, you can check out that. See you guys next time, and goodbye.